Let me tell you a little bit about Mary Lou. Mary Lou was appointed to the Board of Regents in 1984. She serves as the chairperson of the subcommittee on affirmative action. She has a bachelor's from Anna Maria College in Worcester, a master's in English from Assumption College in Worcester, and is currently a doctoral student at the University of Massachusetts School of Ed. She's taught English for 20 years. She currently teaches English at Clark University in Worcester, and we just left an English class where we had a delightful discussion on the impact of language and sexism in our language with Will Roberts just the hour previous to this. Her community services have been, she's been on the board of directors of the YWCA in Worcester, past president of the board of directors of the Worcester Public Library. She's a Democratic committee member for the city of Worcester. She's been a past delegate to the state Democratic conventions and currently serves as the book reviewer for the Worcester Sunday Telegram on contemporary fiction by women. Would you please make a warm welcome for Mary Lou Anderson.
I want to thank President Provo and Ann Wiley and all of you for inviting me here to Greenfield Community College. I live in Worcester, so the drive is not very far. Most of the meetings for the Board of Regents are in Boston because the office is in Boston. And any of you who have had anything to do with Boston, when you're dealing with people who are in Boston, they don't think anything exists but the city of Boston. And so they're very reluctant. I have yet to get them to come to Worcester, and we have 3 state schools in Worcester. I keep telling them that. So that it's always fun to come out to visit the other state schools, besides the schools that exist in Boston and that big one in Amherst there. We have been making the rounds. I was hoping we would come to Greenfield. I thought October would be a nice month in Greenfield, and I thought it would be nice if we could see the foliage and visit the campus. We are visiting at North Adams State and Westfield State, and in December we're at Northern Essex Community College. And I think it's good to come to the campuses because I teach at a college, so I'm a little bit familiar with the academic atmosphere, but for other regions who are in other areas, I think it's a good experience to visit schools. And also, being a board that governs the state system and operating out of Boston, I think you tend to see things only in terms of the State House. And while that's certainly important to the budget, it's not important to every other thing that exists in the state schools. Today I'm talking about comparable worth, but I want to begin by telling you that my talk will not run certainly an hour by any means. Not that you couldn't talk for a long time on comparable worth, you can, but I didn't want to go for an hour. What I'd like to do is to talk with you about the issue of comparable worth, to make the distinction between comparable worth and affirmative action, and then to answer any questions that you have, whether they're in regard to comparable worth or affirmative action, or any questions you might have in regard to the Board of Regents and to what our agenda is for the year, what issues that we face, and we do face an extremely large one. And you may have some questions that you're curious about or you want to ask, and if I can answer them, I'll be happy to do that. Before I begin my talk, I have to give credit to people. I am a feminist, and I've been very active in the issue of affirmative action with the Board of Regents, but I am not as extremely familiar on the issue of comparable worth as I should be, because it's relatively, in a sense it's relatively new, but in another sense it's not. So that I have to give credit to people who have helped me with this particular issue, namely Secretary of Economic Affairs Evelyn Murphy, who serves under our Governor Michael Dukakis, has done a lot of research on the issue of comparable worth, and I have spoken with her and received much information from her office, so that my speech is based on a lot of information I received from her office. Also, there are 2 sources to read, and I borrowed largely from those sources in understanding the issue of comparable worth. One of them is a paper called A Want of Harmony, Perspectives on Wage Discrimination, and it was put together by Ronnie Steinberg, who's a senior research associate at the Center for Women on Government at the State University of New York in Albany. And the other source is a book that's edited by a woman named Helen Remick, and the title is Comparable Worth and Pay Equity, and it's published by Temple University Press. So that I want to give credit to those sources for helping me in the issue of comparable worth. Comparable worth is defined as the concept of equal pay for work of comparable value. Comparable worth is and can offer the hope of equalizing the determinants of occupation and earnings for all women by attacking the core of the male-female economic differential. Now, comparable worth differs from affirmative action, although in a sense it comes under the umbrella of affirmative action. But I think, in terms of this talk, we have to make a distinction. If we look at the issue of affirmative action, we know that affirmative action is a plan or a program to remedy the effects of past discriminations in employment, education, and other activities, and to prevent its recurrence. Now, affirmative action encompasses many things, and I think many of you are familiar with the things affirmative action encompasses, such as a workforce utilization plan, analysis, goals, timetables, how you go about recruiting women and minorities into a business or an academic institution. Comparable worth is concerned with money. It's concerned with pay, and that is the distinction. And in many ways, that's more difficult, because when you are asking an employer to give you more money, it's extremely difficult. To further define comparable worth, let me say that comparable worth is a phrase used to refer to the idea that jobs which are of equal value to an employer, all right, and that's tough, jobs that are of equal value to an employer based on effort, skill, responsibility, and working conditions should receive equal wages. Now, comparable worth makes comparisons of jobs that are not identical and in fact may be quite different, and I will talk about that as we go along. If we look at the issue of comparable worth, for example, it goes beyond something that was called the Equal Pay Act. Now, the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, so that's about 22 years ago. The Equal Pay Act provides for equal pay for jobs, the performance of which requires equal skill, effort, and responsibility. But in that Equal Pay Act, exceptions were made. So that the exceptions made were if you worked in a system where there was a seniority system, a merit system, and it also depends upon this term called the availability of labor, which is a very nebulous kind of term because it's always used, I think, to keep women out of positions. All right, what kind of jobs fall under comparable worth? Well, let me give an example. If we're talking about, quote, non-professional jobs, if you are a beautician or you are a barber, all right, usually a beautician is a woman and a barber is a man. Now, you can have men who are beauticians, and you can have women who are barbers. However, traditionally, a woman is a beautician and a man is a barber. So suppose the state of Massachusetts hires you to go into state hospitals, nursing homes run by the state, prisons, for example, and you're to provide services, cut hair, do other kinds of things beauticians and barbers do. Well, those are jobs of equal value, I would assume. I think many of us would, but they're paid differently. A barber is paid more money than a beautician is paid, in some instances, in some cases. So that a case like that, jobs like that, would come under the concept of comparable worth. Now, in 1981, and this is an extremely interesting case, the U.S. Supreme Court opened the door slightly to the issue of comparable worth in charges of discrimination in comparison of non-identical jobs. There was a case called Gunther versus the county of Washington in the state of Oregon. In that particular case, Alberta Gunther was a jail matron, and she, on behalf of her sister matrons, made a case that they were doing the same job as the guards, but they were paid considerably lower money. So they brought the case to court. It's interesting, a job evaluation was made and applied to these two jobs, matron and guard. And it was discovered that the matrons do 95% of what the guards do, but they were paid a little less than 70% of what the guard made. So they went through their union, and they're represented by AFSCME, and they went through their union, and eventually they kind of settled the case out of court. But it's interesting that when they were heard, the Supreme Court said that Title VII did allow comparisons of unlike jobs, and that the payment schedule chosen by the county might be intentionally discriminatory. Now, it's interesting to look at the language, because the court said it might be discriminatory. It didn't say that it is. It said it might be discriminatory. But as I mentioned, the case was sent back to the lower court, and that's all the Supreme Court did. They just sent it back to the lower court, and eventually the matrons, through their union, made a settlement. Now, that has not ended. That has not ended, because recently the state appealed that lower court decision, and it was sent up to a federal appeals court that was heard by three justices, a three-member panel actually, and they said, all right, that federal laws banning sex discrimination in jobs does not compel employers to provide equal pay for different jobs. And that is seen as a blow to the issue of comparable worth. And that's the most, as far as I know, the most recent decision at the moment. All right? It does show you, in a sense, that I think strongly that politics has always a lot to do with everything. And certainly in terms of the federal government and the way the federal government is going and the way President Reagan is looking at the court and looking at issues, that we are going to see, at least coming out of the federal government, a kind of a step backwards in terms of affirmative action and in terms of the issues of comparable worth. I do not believe that in the state of Massachusetts that you are going to see the present governor step backwards in terms of affirmative action. Whether they deal with comparable worth, they attempted to, and they didn't go very far. But I don't think that things will be as bad in Massachusetts as they can be in other states. But it's interesting that there have to be a lot more battles before the issue of comparable worth is discussed, if not at least but settled. I think also in several important lower court cases, and in the lower courts we're talking about the federal district court or the Court of Appeals, suits are attacking the idea that the prevailing wage rate can be used by employers as an acceptable reason for paying women less than men. And certainly, I'm not even getting into the issue of minorities who happen to be male, who happen to be not male, they're not minorities at all, who happen to be blacks or Hispanics. I'm not getting into that issue. I'm talking about women, but it would apply to blacks and Hispanics also. But I don't have enough statistics or information, and I have to make myself more aware of that, so I cannot speak to that particular issue. I'm only talking about women. But it's interesting in the city of Los Angeles, in what is billed as a victory for the concept of comparable worth, the city of Los Angeles has agreed to raise the pay of workers in municipal jobs traditionally held by women, such as clerks and librarians. And in those particular jobs, which often pay 10 to 15% less than a variety of positions held by men, city officials and the union agreed the pay gap was unfair to women workers. So the case did not go to court, but was settled through the city and its union, who represented the women in that case. And I believe very strongly that women, if they work in an institution where there is a union, that one way to work toward equity is to work through the union. Now, I hope I don't rankle union people who may be in this audience. I'm a former member of the MTA, having taught in a public institution for a long time, and I really believe strongly in unions and believe that the way to go is through the union. But you may meet with resistance depending upon the people in the union. I mean, it's like any institution. An institution is only as good as the people who happen to be there. But I really believe that one avenue is through union effort, because historically unions have always fought for the rights of minorities, for the right of the worker. So they did. They went through the union, and the mayor of Los Angeles was willing and was seen in a position that he was pushing comparable worth, Mayor Bradley, and so that they managed to get a better kind of a pay, and they were moving toward that comparable worth issue, and they didn't have to go to court. So there was a sense of cooperation between the worker, the union who represented the worker, and then they made their case to the employer, who in the long run happened to be the mayor of Los Angeles. Now, equal employment comes about when unions and civil rights groups and women's organizations work together. And historically that is true, that when the union will work with whatever group it is, whether it is a group of Hispanics, a group of blacks, a group of women, whatever group, if they band together, then they're very powerful, and then they happen to be heard. Historically, equal pay for equal work in the late 19th century and the early 20th century was put forth by the socialist movement in the United States, as well as the trade unions and women's rights and the suffragette movement. Now, the demand for equal pay for women surfaced in World War I, and it became a widespread political demand during World War II. And I think that's obvious because, quote, the men were at war and somebody had to run the country in terms of the jobs, and that's when women went to work. Now, it's interesting that the trade unions at this time were great proponents of equal pay for women. And they took complaints. I mean, if there were cases where a company was paying a woman less, even though she was doing, quote, a man's job, the union went to the War Labor Board and made a complaint and fought for the woman so that she got that equal pay. Now, it's interesting, a woman by the name of Ruth Milkman has made a study about trade unions and this whole issue of equal pay. And she said that all these activities around World War II, around the issue of equal pay, she made this interesting observation about the union support for equal pay. She said union support for equal pay was stimulated primarily out of fear that women entering male jobs would lead to a wartime and post-war reduction of the wage rate for those jobs. So that really, she said, what the union was doing was protecting the job for the man so that when he came back, he wouldn't go into a job paying him $1 less because a woman had done it. So she said it wasn't out of altruism, but self-preservation that many unions have insisted on equal pay for equal work. I have to put that aside in there because I read that and it made sense to me. However, whatever the reason, and I really believe this in terms of politics, whatever the reason, as long as the vote is there, don't question it. Because once you start doing that, you get lost politically. You know, as long as they come down on your side, accept it. And when you start going into motives, I mean, the motives are interesting, and that's what makes political analysis so intriguing and interesting. Why does someone support someone over someone else? That's always to me, that's the most interesting, fascinating side of politics. But I never question a vote. When I'm on the Board of Regents, if I'm pushing an issue, I don't question why someone at the end of the board, at the end of the table is voting with me, even though we're as opposite as night and day. I take the vote, I'm grateful for the vote, I'm thankful for it, and that's how you win. And it's true that historically, the issue of comparable worth, if it is to come about in our century, in our time, all right, it'll come about through the work of the union, the women's group, the civil rights group, and whatever other group is out there. That's how it will come about. But I think it's important to understand always the context in which it is done and always why something is the way it is. The issue of comparable worth, as you know, is concerned with wage discrimination. And that results, I think, partly from the systematic undervaluation of the work performed predominantly by women and minorities. There's no question about that. I was in a very interesting class here at Greenfield Community College, a class on language and composition, and the students were extremely, I thought, very, very bright, very articulate, very interesting. They had a lot of questions, and we talked about language and what words have come to mean and why words associated with women have taken on a negative connotation and why words associated with men have always taken on a positive connotation. And as one bright student said in the class, there isn't a word in the language associated with man that has not become more powerful. If anything, the word is more powerful. It certainly doesn't take on a negative connotation. And you look at the word governor and the feminine counterpart, governess. And who wouldn't want to be the governor as opposed to the governess, right? Not only in terms of power, but in terms of money. But the point is that if you look at jobs historically that have been done by women, they have always been undervalued. And the moment men come into the profession, they rise in value. And I can't think of a better profession to talk about than teaching, right? Teaching historically was a woman's profession. And if you look at the primary grades, it's still largely women. It's when you move up and you get into high school, into college, that it becomes male. And historically, now I don't believe teachers by any means are overpaid. I don't believe that for 1 minute. If anything, teacher salaries are far too low and teachers are undervalued in our society, and I believe that sincerely. But I think that the pay began to move up a bit when men came into the profession and unions came into the profession. And there were all kinds of discriminatory things because women were in the profession. I live in the city of Worcester, and when I went to grammar school in Worcester, I used to be curious why all these women I had weren't married. There was a reason. If you were a married woman at one time, certainly in the city of Worcester, you lost your job. Married women couldn't teach. So that was not true of a man. I mean, it was expected, you know, right? But the woman lost her job. So there are all kinds of, I mean, I don't think we have to argue. It's a kind of moot. There's no point to argue that women's jobs have been undervalued. Look at the nursing profession, right? Nurses are valuable. They work very hard. They're very skilled. They're very bright. They have to work hard to get that certificate or degree if they're going for a degree. I really maintain that the moment men creep in there, you're going to see a different change in that profession. There's no question about it, because they're going to, you know, demand things differently from the way women do, or the way we do as women. And I think there are all sorts of reasons why that happens. But anyhow, getting back to the issue of comparable worth, I think that if you had a comparable worth policy, that it would involve identifying and correcting the undervaluation of women's work. And it needs a technique and a standard for assessing the worth of a job. And that is not easy to do. So that if you're going to look at jobs across the spectrum, if you're going to implement a comparable worth policy, what you have to do is you have to have a standard. And you have to have some kind of technique, some kind of evaluation to determine what jobs are worth. Now, that's usually used to say you can't implement comparable worth, you see. You can't do that. Or another argument against comparable worth is, well, the moment you do this, you see, the moment companies have to pay women all this kind of money, well, you know, they're going to just start laying off women. And that's the threat that companies make. You know, in higher education, at the State College, Framingham State College, the EEOC brought suit against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts because historically at Framingham they have underpaid women. Women are not paid the same as men. Now I'm sure that doesn't happen in any other state college. If it does, we'll find out about it, right? However, you know what happened in that case. The lower court sided with EEOC and the women, then the appeals court, then the regents told the trustees, we're not going to appeal that case anymore. And the women won the suit, which is well over $2 million. And now the legislature has to appropriate the money. Now, we're not going to lay off women at Framingham State College. You know, we're not going to start saying, well, because we had to pay them more money, that we're going to start knocking them out of jobs. Ridiculous. Never will happen, you know. We should. We should, yes. That's the big question. Will we? I think with the new president at Framingham State, we will. And we will monitor it. That's one thing the regents can do. We can monitor the hiring. Absolutely. But see, that's the argument that is used. Now, when you are in an institution, such as higher ed, that happens to be unionized, if you've got good union support, the union should be there protecting the worker. When you're getting into companies where there is no union, you've got to rely on the employer, you're going to run into problems. But at the same time, what's the alternative? Not to push for equal pay, not to push for comparable worth, to keep things as they are? I don't believe that's something that we should do. I think we have got to continue to fight for comparable worth. If you're going to come up with a standard, what kind of a standard would you come up with? Well, the standard would have to be based partially on market wages. What is the market wage going for a particular job? And partially firm-based, and let me explain that. That is, while there's an overlap in wage rates across firms, the overall wage structure within a firm differs from other firms. There's no question about that. So that you would have to deal with what that wage rate is and what is firm-based. In other words, some firms we know pay more money than other firms, and that's why some firms attract some people as opposed to other firms. Comparable worth standards will have to be based partially on wage, the wage rate, the firm, and also the union. And when there is no union, it will have to be based on the employer, simply because there's no union. It's probably fair to say there can be no absolute standard of comparable worth, just as it's fair to say that in the long run there's no such thing as total equality. That just doesn't exist. We can just work to make things more equitable. All right, so that for me to say that we're going to have this absolute standard, that doesn't exist any more than equality exists. I'd like to think I have an equal marriage. I don't. And no woman does. We happen to marry men. That's our problem, right? So, I mean, we don't. I mean, there's no question about it. We can have some unions that tend to be more equitable. There's no question about it. But when you're dealing with men and we are women, I believe this, and I think if you're a woman, you know it. There is no equality when it comes to them. It's just that's the case. So we have to always work very hard. It's probably fair to say, I mentioned there's no absolute standard. However, looking at wage discrimination for purposes of comparable worth, I think there are two objectives that have to be met. One, do the salaries of women, and obviously minorities, reflect a consistent standard, or are they depressed simply because women fill the position? And that's one objective when you're dealing with comparable worth you have to look at. Do the salaries of women reflect a consistent standard, or are they depressed simply because those jobs are held by women? Also, the second objective when you're dealing with the issue of comparable worth is you have to pinpoint job titles that may be undervalued and develop and correct this kind of discrimination. So you have to look at those job titles and see if that job has been undervalued, and you have to correct that. Now, you need a technique to describe job content accurately and consistently. You've got to deal with a job content and job evaluation. But industries are doing this all the time. They're making evaluations of a job. Certainly in education, we are valuing and looking at certain jobs and what people do. So you can do it. There's no question you can do it. But to turn around and say it can never be done because you can never be totally fair. Of course, no one's ever totally fair. I'm always going to be more partial to me. That's why I'm more partial to women. I'm a woman. Why can't I be on my own side? Wouldn't make sense if I weren't. So I think that we have to begin with that kind of assumption. That is true. There's a truth. And if we deny that, we're not being true and we're not being fair. Comparable worth is controversial because it threatens to upset the way the labor market and society is organized. And whenever you threaten the way society and the labor market is organized, it's going to be controversial. The other issue is that comparable worth appears costly, and I use the word appear because companies will argue, certainly the Commonwealth of Massachusetts will argue, you know, look, how much more money can we come up with, you see? But I think in the long run, if we don't do this, we end up shortchanging ourselves. We certainly shortchange the future. We certainly shortchange all our daughters and our sisters who are out there. There's no question in the long run that it may cost a bit more money, but in the long run, it's the better approach to take. It's like the issue, and it's all encompassed, it's like the issue of, that we're facing now in higher education. What do we do about this large Hispanic population in Massachusetts that we're choosing to ignore and not to educate? Now, I'm not talking about your college. I'm talking about all higher education, whether it's public or private. What are we doing? We're ignoring it because we're coming up with all these roadblocks and saying, well, you can't do this because of that reason, and you can't do this because of that reason, and you know, we just can't. We're having a hard time educating people. But if we don't do that, we're going to have a whole unskilled labor force out there. We're going to have a whole group of people who have no in this society. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Somewhere along the line, they're going to affect you and me. Somewhere along the line. Isn't it better to get students when they're very young, whether they're in grammar school or they're in junior high or middle school, identify them, work with them, encourage them to go on to school, whether it's a technical school, a voc school, a community college, a college or university, to find their skill, their expertise and develop it, can only make us greater. It can only make us a better country, so that in the long run we have to keep thinking about that, and we can't keep putting up all the obstacles. And it's not easy. You know, no one ever said anything in life was easy. Or education. Education is very, very tough. But if we don't do that, in the end we shortchange ourselves and the future. And those people we are concerned about, who are our children and our children's children, so that we've got to do that. So comparable worth appears costly. It also challenges basic cultural assumptions. Comparable worth would redistribute economic resources and the labor market, and it would give power to women, and that's most frightening of all. Suddenly it would empower all of us in this room who happen to be women, and that's one of the reasons you find so much resistance. Comparable worth battles will continue, and they're going to continue, as I mentioned, with a coalition of unions, civil rights groups, and women's organizations, because it does provide the key to equality. Economic equality, there's no question about it, because the wage gap is the oldest indicator of sexual inequality. And as long as the labor market remains sex segregated, because it's certainly race segregated, then there's no justice for women. And there's no justice for minorities in this country. And so that's where the battle will be. And it will continue to be waged over and over again. So I'm going to stop right now because I'm going to lose my voice in 2 minutes here. But I would be happy to answer questions, any kinds of questions that you have in regard to affirmative action, comparable worth, or any issue that comes up before the Board of Regents. And I thank you for having me at Greenfield Community College. Thank you. So, any questions? Yes.
The usual response to comparable worth argument is the Sam Urban response that it would cause legal chaos and the legal system would be overloaded and lawyers would be getting rich and be the primary benefits. Is there a kind of standard response to that?
Well, I don't have the standard response. My response will be, what else is new? I think the legal system is in chaos, and I think lawyers continue to get rich. And I think that all you have to do is look at colleges in Worcester, such as the College of the Holy Cross, which has a big pre-law program. And everybody keeps saying, you know, lawyers are a glut on the market. What are these kids going into law for? You know, they're all going into law, you know, and they're all graduating with their BA, you know, out of Holy Cross and going to law school. So I think that, I think it's just an obstacle they like to put up because it's going to create some work and some kind of legal maneuvering and expertise in that area. I think it's the standard roadblock that's used. So that's my response. Any other questions? Yes.
Not a question, just something else to add to your response to Bill. I wouldn't mind making a lawyer a little richer. If on the other end, I could also be a little richer.
Yes, that's a good response. As long as you could be a little richer, you know. Who knows, in the future there may be all these lawyers who specialize in comparable worth, you know, right? I mean, they're all specializing in growth and condominium conversion, right? That's a big field today. So corporate law, you know, tax law, so they might as well focus in on that. Yes?
When you are talking about the standards that need to be used to evaluate jobs to make them more comparable, and salaries, and you talk about you could be based partly on the market system of the wages, and then the firm base of the wages based on what the firms have and the unions. When there is no union and you base it on the employer, how do you base that? Are you basing it on precedent? And if you're basing it on precedent, does it mean you remain with a depressed wage?
Well, when there is no union, you know, you do have some companies who pride themselves on no union by offering union wages or above the union. That's been their way of keeping unions out of their companies. So that when you're basing it on an employer, I suppose you would go and bargain with the employer the way you would have to get the union to support your idea that historically a beautician did not make what a barber made, but that she was doing the same kind of job. You would have to argue that with your employer. And I'm sure if there were federal guidelines that came down, you know, then the employer would have to follow those. So yeah, you're always going to be dealing with a precedent. You're always going to be dealing with the way things were, you know. But if you're looking at what was the barber paid, if historically he were paid $6 an hour and the beautician were paid $4.50 an hour, and you said, look, I'm doing the same things that he is doing, all right, and I have the same kind of, basically the same kind of background, then I should get that too. So you would go to the employer rather than through the union. That's all. Yes?
Within the firm, though, I think one of the difficulties is comparing jobs and determining what the standards will be for evaluating. So companies are evaluating jobs all the time, but if you start thinking about skills and what kind of skills we're talking about and who has them,
right,
and how do they get them, and what is the market value of those skills and scarcity and that sort of thing, it gets to be fairly tricky and requires not only thinking, I think, about inequities for women, but also inequities for more the laboring class, let's say, within that company, as opposed to the
white collar.
class.
Yeah, whenever you're dealing with an issue of job description, job evaluation, you're always going to be in very tricky areas. I mean, who is to say, I mean, can Greenfield Community College function without all the people who are here? Now, you know, some people might argue, well, they can function very well without everyone except me, you know. But I mean, I think you know, the truth is that you can't open a school without certain types of people, you know. You have to have people who maintain the plant, and you have to have people, obviously, who teach, who guide, who administer the building. I mean, all of those people are valuable, and without one or the other, it doesn't function. The problem you get into is determining the skill that's required, the expertise, the background. To some extent, historically, we pay people for their background. Now, one of the obvious exceptions is teachers. You know, if you look at people who are in the profession who have the high degree, you know, the doctorate, historically, they've always been paid lower than lawyers and doctors, medical doctors who have those degrees. And, you know, and we know all the arguments that are given against paying professors more money, you know, that you really don't work, you don't work, you teach. I mean, we know all the standard jokes, you know, you don't work full-time. I mean, all those standards. So there are ways, I think teachers, professors have slowly tried to erode that, but it's a long host. So I can imagine, sure, there's going to be all kinds of problems coming up, but I think we can't ignore it. Nonetheless, it's another issue we have to deal with.
I think one of the most significant issues in the state system is the whole classification of clerical work.
Yes.
And that's uniform throughout all the different parts of the state system. And they're incredibly underpaid, and yet try to ever run any part of the system without them.
That's right. You hit the nail on the head. Well, the Regents is now negotiating again for that. We have an example in the state system. As you know, one of the schools that comes under the umbrella of the Board of Regents is the University of Massachusetts, and it has 3 campuses, one of which is a medical school and a hospital. And so we have to admit that to the system of higher ed, it's a unique kind of situation. I mean, a medical school is a bit different from other kinds of schools. Then we've got the hospital. Well, because the Regents is the bargaining agent for higher ed, we bargain with everybody. The chancellor at UMass, Dr. Tranquata, would prefer that we not bargain with the nurses there, but we do. And we're going to keep bargaining with the nurses. Now, I can understand, you know, from an administrator's point of view, he has to run a hospital in the city of Worcester where there are 5 other hospitals, and if the state is paying the nurses more money than the other hospitals, then he has trouble with them. So I understand his point of view, but nonetheless, from the point of view of the Regents, you know, we can't pay nurses, to me, less money than we pay other people of comparable jobs. That's not fair. I mean, we're the employer. So you're always getting into those situations. And certainly, I think we're going to look closely, I hope we are anyhow, at that clerical contract. I agree, because they are underpaid.
Well, of course, all the part-time people we depend on throughout the system who aren't protected by any contract.
Well, that's yes. The part-time issue is a very serious, sensitive issue to all colleges, private and public. And you know that in New York, and I'm not sure, maybe some of you know this, I don't know whether it was in SUNY or not, but in New York, a part-timer who had taught in the system for 8 years, teaching part-time, sued for tenure and was granted tenure through the courts. So one of the fears that private colleges have, and the state has, of course, is that if you are a part-time person and you are teaching a full load and you have done that for the 6 years, And you've always been, I mean, part-timers are evaluated. I'm part-time, so I know that. Part-timers are evaluated, and if you're always giving this evaluation, that's very good, and you keep coming back because they keep asking you, then don't you have the right? So it's a very serious problem. I know in some of the private colleges what they have done is they have said that if you are part-time and our full load is 3 courses a semester, because in most private schools the course load is 3 courses a semester, then you can't teach more than 2, and that's it. That's how they get around it. But it's still slave labor, and the private schools pay better than the state schools, and the state schools pay abominably low. I know that, and no benefits, So that's a whole other issue. And if we look at part-time, are most of them women?
Yeah.
Probably are. All right, so that's another issue.
That's all right, they have husbands bringing in the money anyway.
They have husbands bringing in the money anyhow. Yes, Linda.
I'm just curious as to the role of the Board of Regents in terms of, I was hearing what you were saying about unions and how supportive they were to women back in World War II and things like that. And a lot of what you said, I'm thinking about how does that hit home? And I have like 1,000 things that I can think of. And one of them right now that I feel that directly affects me is that in the last negotiations, our union voted for a straight percentage increase in terms of salaries, rather than the usual flat grant of a particular sum of money and then a percentage increase. And really, who does it affect in terms of increasing our rank system, our salary system that's already discriminatory? But what happens is the people on the lower end of that salary schedule had a very small increase, where people on the upper end had a large increase. And when you look across the community college as to who those junior faculty are, they are women.
Sure.
Because we weren't, for whatever reasons, for whatever particular college may not have been put in on a higher level or whatever. And so what is the Board of Regents' role in terms of the union and then the President's Council that the union negotiates with? In terms of if a similar thing happens like this, you obviously wouldn't be supporting them.
Well, let's say that as the regents, we direct the chief negotiator, and we've already had one meeting already about negotiations, and we're meeting monthly about negotiations, and the committee to deal with that issue is the Personnel Committee, and I'm on that committee just by virtue of chairing affirmative action. So that we have already directed Jay Laporte, who is the Vice Chancellor for Employee Relations, that we want to see equity in terms of women's salaries. So he is aware of that, and that is coming from the board, from the members of the board. So, and we will ask them, I mean, each month we meet and we ask for an update on negotiations, and they are beginning the new round of, now he per se doesn't negotiate with everybody. As you know, there are all these different firms I keep reading about who go out and negotiate, you know, Mahoney, Hawks and Golding in Boston, and what's the group out in Springfield? They were negotiating with the University of Massachusetts. I can't, Scola, Abbott, and that's the other. So yeah, we have told them, I mean, we give the direction, we give the input, and we ask for reports to see what is happening, and I'll keep pursuing it, so.
I mean, I think the major issue of the last negotiation was that our salaries were much lower than it was kind of getting them up.
Yes, that was the assumption under the community college contract, because I came on the board during that controversy.
But
I'm
thinking now that it would be nice in terms of the union, which I'm not expecting them to really support it, since a lot of them are upper level professors, and they're only supporting themselves by having a straight percentage increase. But to have somebody who has some power to look at the discrimination of junior faculty, which are mainly women, in at least our system.
All right, well, I certainly will ask that question and talk to the negotiator. We have a meeting in 2 weeks in Boston. Did you have a question?
Yes, I'd just like to back up Linda's point. My understanding is that in the last round of negotiations, in effect, management said you can have this much money divide it up the way you would like.
Okay,
And it was the union who chose to divide it on a percentage basis.
yeah,
And
yeah.
as a highly paid male, I object. I think it should be done differently.
All right, yes, my point with the unions is if you look at historically how equity has come about in this country, that you cannot deny that kind of union movement together with other movements that then got things, and the reason I told you about why it was done, so you understand the context and what it was done, that sometimes, you know, as a woman in the union, as women in the union, you have to buck a certain kind of male establishment, and you're just going to have to get control of that union. And it can be done. I was a teacher in Worcester for many years, and the women got control of the union. We elected a woman president. That's what we did. And it changed things a bit. You know, we did. We outnumbered the men. There were more of us teaching than there were men. We outnumbered them, and we took over. You know, it's since gone back to a man, but and I'm out of the system. However, you know, what I'm saying is historically, that's powerful. That's a powerful thing. But I will certainly look into that and talk to the negotiator about that. Yes.
I just have a follow-up question on the comparable worth in relation to the same issue. Under our contract, we have people who are paid, let's say, $20,000 to teach, who do exactly the same work as someone who's paid $43,000 to teach. Those are the 19 and 43 at the bottom and the top of our salary schedule. They're doing the same work.
Does it have to do with seniority? No?
Well, not necessarily. Basically, it happens to be where, in this particular contract, wherever you were, unless you got promoted, you got the same percent increase. So someone making 16 got the same percent as someone making 33,000.
Yeah.
The result of that is to make the spread that much bigger.
Sure, it makes the spread that much. Well, I will raise that issue.
Irrespective of sex, can those people who are basically underpaid in comparable terms, can they file suit against somebody? In other words, irrespective of sex.
Yeah.
That's a comparable worth issue. We've got two teachers who are doing exactly the same work, and their salaries are completely different. Same department, same degrees.
Can you file a grievance? I don't, you know, I mean, that's a route that you could go in terms of...
We have nothing to grieve. Who can we grieve? We can't grieve management.
Well, why was one paid so much more to begin with than the other? Is it degree, skill, background?
Not in the contract, no, it's just historically.
It's the salary?
Why someone was time in the system. No.
Time, seniority, is it time in the system?
Yeah, people with the same time were being paid completely different salaries.
Well, I would think there's some avenue. Off the top of my head, I don't know it. I have to tell you an anecdote. I went over to Worcester State to give a talk to a women's group and about affirmative action. And when I got at the end of my talk and everybody asked questions, someone came up and said to me, "Now look, I have a suit I want to file against the State College and against the Commonwealth. Can you sit down and help me?" And I said, "Now wait a minute. When I tell you that I'm, you know, sympathetic, I'm on your side. I'm not sitting down and telling people how to sue the Board of Regents. That's not my role. And I'm sure you're not asking me to do that. But there must be some avenue that you can pursue to question whether you talk to the administration or through the union or the last resort, the Board of Regents. There's got to be some way to answer that kind of question. And I don't know all the particulars in the background, but there's got to be some way that's got to be answered. And then maybe it won't be. All right? Okay? Sure.
Comment on other countries that might serve as models for the rest of the world. Other countries that have
A comparable worth. Australia is one country. Australia, continent rather. Australia is a, got to get my geography straight when I talk. I know Australia, but I'm not, I just know in having read that they have instituted a comparable worth, and it seems to be working, so that they're supposed to be the model. All right? But that's the only one I know.
Isn't the state of Wisconsin?
They have done some things.
They have done this in a way that...
You talked about countries or in the world. Yeah.
Any large organization.
All right.
The state of Wisconsin, my understanding is that they have done this. And on paper, apparently, the financial damage is not going to be anywhere near what was projected at first.
Oh, I'm sure it won't be.
But it's only been a few years and they don't know yet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you for your participation, and I'm sure Mary Lou would be willing to answer any individual questions if people want to spend a couple minutes doing that. Thanks again for coming.